Nurses Month. I'm here with Dean Linda Norman to kick off DUSN's celebration of nursing with a discussion about some of the people who developed our profession to where it is today. The panel tonight will talk about how nursing is misrepresented in the media today. But Dean Norman, you say things started out that way as well. How so?
Well, when you look at what was the character of nursing back in the mid 1800s, what we saw was a character called Sari Gamp that Charles Dickens portrayed. And Sari was described, and I'm going to read this, as dissolute, sloppy, and generally drunk. She became a notorious picture of nursing, in particularly in the UK, in that particular time of untrained, incompetent nurses in the early Victorian age. So when you think about what Florence Nightingale did in the 1860s, was to be able to train nurses. I like to use the word educate, but she called it training. And she also wanted to change that perception of what a nurse was, so that nurses were ones who did have an academic background, but they also were of good repute. So when you think about what Florence did, she had nurses that they lived in essentially a dorm. They were unmarried, and there were so many strict rules about what they could do and couldn't do. And that was to really dramatically change the perception of what a nurse was in that particular area. And of course, Florence gained a lot of fame and clout because of the work that she did in the Crimea, to really be able to show what nursing can do to be able to improve the health status of a population. So when nursing programs were beginning in the UK and particularly in the US, there was that idea of a dorm, of it being single women, and and having lots of restrictions to make sure that there was a good moral code for the nurses outside of what they did in their care delivery and inside. So schools of nursing began, particularly in the US, to pop up in lots of different places as hospitals became the place where people went for care delivery. Previously, the only time you went to a hospital is when you're getting ready to die. But care delivery began to improve, the medical care improved, and nurses were ones, schools of nursing, that had lots of students. They had a few registered nurses because they didn't need that many, because there were so many student nurses that were there to actually man the hospital or person the hospital. But this idea of having only single women, and if you got married, you got kicked out. If you got married, you couldn't be a nurse. So, excuse me, the image of nursing changed quite a bit from the Sari Gamp to being very high standard type of particularly women. Now, what was interesting is because hospitals were being staffed essentially by the student nurses. So what happened when they graduated? Because they were graduating an awful lot of people. And they went into private duty. That when people would be recovering from an illness, they were recovering from childbirth, they had private duty nurses. So most of the time in those early 1900s, where nurses were employed was more in home care than it was in hospitals. And that was because they were using student nurses to be able to staff the hospitals. That also impacted the education that they had, because they had to have their classes outside of the time that they were on duty. And the nursing at that point was really more skill-based. It was passing medications, doing treatments, that sort of thing, following the physician orders. And it wasn't as much of any kind of an independent practice. So we sort of fast forward to what happened during the war, and particularly World War II, where there was a huge need for nurses in the armed forces. And they created the Cadet Corps, where they shortened the time for nurses to be educated. And Vanderbilt actually had a Cadet Corps where they they decreased the time period to about 2.5 years for the Cadet Corps so that they could really be educated quickly and go into the military. Well, that's when, as a nation, we began to realize nurses really were the ones who were helping to get these soldiers back, very much like what Florence Nightingale did, get them back into service, help them with the injuries that they may have, and to be able to cope with those, to heal from those. But they realized what value that nurses brought. And it was particularly in acute care types of settings, they realized they needed to have registered nurses in addition to what they had with the student nurses. So nursing schools after that began to change, where there was more emphasis on teaching the academic program with the clinical practice, but the care delivery that was done, particularly in acute care, transitioned to have more of registered nurses in the care delivery. So in the 50s and 60s, we began to see a transformation within nursing education to have more emphasis on academics. And that's when, BSN programs began to flourish. Now, we always say at Vanderbilt, we're traditionally ahead of our time, is that our BSN program began in 1925. But across the nation, they really flourished in the 50s and 60s, to where we had more BSN programs coming on board, and as opposed to hospital-based diploma programs. That the focus was really on educating nurses to be able to do critical thinking, to be able to make those clinical judgments, and to be able to have the science of nursing behind what we were doing. So that kind of flourished in the 50s and 60s. And then came our MSN and our doctoral programs. And our MSN programs, clinical specialty programs, began in the 60s and 70s. And then our nurse practitioner movement really began in the 80s, to where we began to have more nurse practitioners. And then in the 90s, it just exploded. That we had our family nurse practitioner programs first, and all of a sudden, healthcare began to realize, nurse practitioners can really do some great things. And it can go beyond primary care to underserved populations. So that's where we began to see the specialties come on board, that we needed to have acute care nurse practitioners. We need to have neonatal nurse practitioners. We needed to have pediatric nurse practitioners in those subspecialties to be able to really be partners and collaborative within the healthcare delivery system. And then our D&P movement came out in the early 2000s to look at what we needed for not only advanced practice nurses, but nurse leaders. So from the time of Sarah Gamp to the time that we have now, the image of nursing has really increased exponentially. And of anything that the pandemic has done is to bring a lot of notoriety to the contribution that nurses make to healthcare delivery. I don't know when a year has ever occurred that we've seen more focus on nurses and the importance and the value that nurses bring to healthcare delivery.
And who have been your role models in your nursing career?
So I want to go back to some leaders in nursing. I joined Sigma Theta Tau in the mid 1980s. I lovingly say, you know, I graduated from nursing school when I was 12. But in the mid 1980s, I joined at Sigma Theta Tau. And one of the people that I met in the first Sigma Theta Tau convention I attended was Virginia Henderson. I had grown up in nursing, learning all about Virginia Henderson. She wrote the quintessential textbook, The Principles of Nursing, that the Henderson Harmon book. And it was one that was about that tall, that thick, that probably every nursing student ended up developing a lot of muscles and carrying it around. But Virginia Henderson was one of those people who first defined nursing and really looked at the science of nursing. So to me, she's one of those people that set us apart as a profession. So she defined nursing, and I'm gonna read the definition that she came up with. Is she described that nursing was assisting individuals, sick or well, in the performance of those activities contributing to health, to recovery, or a peaceful death, that they would perform unaided if they had the requisite strength, will, or knowledge. And she was one of our, I think, first nurse researchers that looked at what are the scientific principles that we need to understand as nurses, as a profession, and to guide the education and the practice of nursing. And it was quite interesting in meeting her, because when I met her in that early 1980s, she was not a young lady. But she was so interested in the future of nursing and the future of the science of nursing. So she was one, I think, who helped us begin to develop what we have as our scientific basis and what we now call evidence-based practice. And then following Virginia was Faye Abdella. And let me give you one more little picture of Virginia Henderson. She was named an honorary member of Vanderbilt's Iota chapter of Sigma Theta Tau. And when you go back in the history, you know, everybody signs the book when you're inducted in Sigma Theta Tau. We have the book that Virginia Henderson signed.
Wow.
So there's a linkage between Virginia Henderson and Vanderbilt. But the other one who really was key in developing the science of nursing was Faye Abdella. And for people who went through school when I did, or a little bit beyond, we all had to create our care plans using Abdella's 21 nursing problems. So she took what Virginia Henderson had and further defined it of, this is what nursing is. This is what independent nursing is, different than changing dressings, giving tube feedings, you know, doing all of the skill piece of nursing care. She clearly defined what was independent nursing. So all of our care plans had to be written. All of our problems had to be done using one of Abdella's 21 problems. And we had to have scientific evidence with it. That was the other thing that she said, is that we needed to be able to have scientific rationale of what you have for your nursing actions. So for those people who are grads of our program, who remember writing care plans and having to cite scientific rationale of page what, where, of what textbook or article, that came because of Abdella, because she wanted us to be able to be an independent profession. And the good part with that is Abdella's 21 was the background for nursing diagnosis and was the background for the movement for nursing diagnosis. And she also served as a nurse researcher, and she was one that looked at, we needed to have doctorally prepared nurses who had their science of nursing. Now, this was in the late 60s, early 70s, where she was really pushing for doctoral programs in nursing. There were many nursing programs that put forward having a PhD in nursing, and their schools denied it because they said nursing did not have enough science, enough literature to be considered a separate profession, a separate discipline. They were a profession, they weren't a discipline. And in order to have a PhD, you needed to be a discipline. So places like University of California, San Francisco, one of our leading institutions, they said they put forward to have a doctoral program, wasn't accepted. That didn't deter them in the least. Then they said, we will have a doctorate of nursing science. So you'll see people have their degrees as DNSC. When you look at my degree, University of Alabama at Birmingham, they put forward their doctoral program in nursing in the 70s, and the university said, nope, it's not a discipline yet. And what they did say then was, okay, we'll start our doctoral program. And that's why mine is a DSN, a Doctorate of Science in Nursing. And later they have now converted that to a PhD. But Abdella was one of the ones who really had this movement going forward of developing the science of nursing. And today we would call it evidence-based practice. And the last person in my life was Phyllis Veronic. Phyllis Veronic was the first nurse researcher at Walter Reed Hospital. And so she really brought forward the contribution that nursing research could do to be able to improve patient care delivery. She was recruited to the University of Virginia. And when I was a fourth-year student, we all of a sudden had a new required course that we had to take of nursing research. So she began that movement of having nursing research as a required piece of a BSN curriculum, and we wouldn't think of not having that now. And Phyllis described research in terms that were easily understandable. She called it Research was your burning yearning for learning.
Hmm.
So for all of us who've done research, you think about that was that first question that we had of our burning yearning for learning. And a couple of other people that really had a huge influence on nursing was Loretta Ford, who started the nurse practitioner movement. And Virginia George was one of the first people that studied with Loretta Ford and started the family nurse practitioner program at Vanderbilt. And we were very early in that. And Virginia and Loretta and a few others really created what a master's prepared nurse practitioner. They moved it from being a certificate to being an academic degree. And look what we've done since then.
Wow, well, nursing has definitely come a long way since Sarah Gamp. You must be so proud of all that Vanderbilt graduates have accomplished with their nursing degrees.
Absolutely. And you know, Vanderbilt has really been at the forefront and pushing what contribution nurses make to healthcare delivery. My predecessor, Colleen Conway Welch, was the one who really put Vanderbilt on the map for being able to do that. And I hope I've continued in that in my 8 years here. But we have really influenced nursing at the master's level, at the bachelor's level when we first started our bachelor's program, at the master's level, and what we've been able to do with our PhD in nursing and our DNP. So we have, you know, almost 1,000 students in our program now. And the influence of Vanderbilt when they finish is tremendous.
Thank you. And I think we all know you've definitely continued to keep Vanderbilt on the map. We are going to pause for 30 seconds and then begin our panel about how nursing is portrayed by the media and entertainment industry. Thanks, everyone.
Good evening, everyone, and happy Nurses Week. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's second session titled How the Media and Entertainment Industry Perpetuate Stereotypes of Nursing and Why That Hurts Everyone. I am Desiree Clement, the moderator of tonight's alumni panel, and we're going to get started with our first question. This will be to Susanna Rudy.
Hello.
Good evening, Susanna.
Hi.
So when looking at the TV media, you've built a career around disaster response, including traveling to New York in the earliest days of COVID, and you led a team of EMTs. How do you feel your experiences compare with that of what is on TV dramas portraying nurses?
Well, the most obvious is that there is no script. There's no transcript to follow. There's no language that you have to memorize to be able to manage a situation in nursing and in disaster situations, particularly. But you know, being a professional nurse, advanced practice nurse, you draw on all of your education, your experiences, everybody that you've ever come into contact with, whether that be patients, families, academic mentors. And you're able to draw on those experiences to act in the moment. In particular, you know, I don't watch much TV, but I do know that nursing and the professional nurses are not portrayed as literally the leadership or forefront in many cases. But what I can tell you in my own personal experience from working disasters, it's the backbone of the system is often the nurses that they are called upon to lead the call, to answer the call, which we have all seen during this last year in the pandemic. We are always on the ready to act and adapt and overcome. And in disaster situations, that is, you know, obviously extremely important the success of the mission, so to speak. For example, in New York, I was asked to come to be the medical officer for EMS providers, but I really wasn't given much information on what the situation was going to entail, other than, can you be available and can you be there tomorrow? So that's just intrinsic to nursing. We are so capable of adapting and overcoming. And that comes from a lot of our experiences and our leadership and education. And, once you're there, you get all the information in real time. And then you are able to develop a plan of action and adapt and overcome pretty much in any situation that you have. So I think that nurses in general and advanced practice nurses in emergency management and in nursing in general are just very innately qualified to act as leadership roles, to act in leadership roles without being designated to that.
Thank you, Susanna. And thank you for all your hard work there in New York and for all that you've done during COVID. So let's turn to a question for Lucretia Bolin. You're an expert sexual assault and trauma nurse practitioner. You're also SANE certified. Do you think the networks could play a role in teaching the public about the realities of trauma and its long-term effects? What are your thoughts on that?
I do. Good evening, everybody. Absolutely. I think the networks have played a big role in educating the public, or just at least putting it on the front page and putting this particular issue center stage. When we talk about sexual assault, we really have to look at the larger context of gender-based violence, which includes sexual harassment, sex trafficking, pedophilia, domestic violence. And the media has brought a great amount of attention. If you actually just look, at just Google any one of those, and you'll get lots of information. The other issue has been the Me Too movement. And that movement was actually founded by a social activist in 2006 on a MySpace page. Her name was Tarana Burke. And 10 years later, the Me Too movement actually exploded. And what we now have are people who are actually advocating for folks to speak up and to speak out. The media has also helped to just really talk about how common this issue. I'd like to, actually what we say is we call it the shadow pandemic. And it's really created a public conversation, a call to arms. There's been a lot of change in practice, change in policy. Most people know about the SART kit backlog. And what used to happen is that these kits would be done. And what you find is that the statute of limitations for the actual crime would actually run out before the kit actually was processed. And so what would happen is that victim survivors wouldn't have a chance to actually take their case to court. And so now what you see is, and it's because of the media attention, that states have moved to remove statutes of limitations. They've moved to increase the time collection for sexual assault evidence. And I think that this is really important because we're also hearing about folks or victims or survivors who are talking about sexual assault that may have occurred 10, 15, 20 years ago. And what we know, I work for the UCSF Zuckerberg San Francisco General Trauma Recovery Center. And what we know is that these types of traumas have long-ranging impacts on people's ability to function, emotional health, sexual health, physical health. One of the other things, and most of you are probably aware of what's called the ACEs, the 10 ACEs, which are the adverse childhood experiences. And what we also know is if you look at that was a study done by CDC and Kaiser. I believe they had a sample size of 17,000. And what they found out that there were 10 things. They were looking for childhood physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect, children who grew up with mental illness or depression, active drug addiction or alcoholism, or living and witnessing domestic violence. If you were to overlay on top of that these other issues such as racism, poverty, systemic oppression, exposure to community violence, microaggression, what we see is that the impact of trauma is long lasting and extremely important for us to begin to sort of tease out how we can actually be of service to people and how we can actually help people to be more healthy and to work with some of these traumas. It won't get rid of them, but at least they'll be able to be more effective. The other thing, the last thing I want to say is that the ACEs, what's been going on, and most people are doing this around the country, is that the ACEs have become a sort of a vital sign. And this is being used in mental health and being used certainly in primary care. And with regard to the commonality of sexual assault, we find that probably 3 out of 4 women, when we expand the definition of sexual assault, and men, can give you a history of having actually been victim of some type of inappropriate touching and the impact that that's had on their mental health and emotional health. So yeah, I absolutely do think the media has done us a great service in that, and actually moving this issue from the shadow out into the spotlight so that we can begin to end sexual violence and gender-based violence.
And it seems like it's also lowered the stigma level too, so that we can discuss it more and bring it forward. And people are more comfortable bringing it forward, I think, to their healthcare providers.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Good point. Thank you.
So Tara, as being in charge of the PhD program there at Vanderbilt and a nurse scientist who publishes extensively yourself on palliative care and pediatrics, what are some of your views of the media's lack of use, unfortunately, as nurses, as expert sources in the media?
Yeah, so thank you for that great question. I think some of it comes from confusion in the field related to the nursing profession, the discipline of nursing, particularly what we see with many of the areas that, like, our PhD students, for example, are studying. A lot of people don't understand what a nurse scientist is. I think, even back to Dean's Norman of just talking about the history of the discipline, a lot of people don't know what we do. I mean, my kid for Mother's Day gave me a little filled out form and thought I was a dentist. It's like, and I mean, granted, my kids are young, school age, but it was just kind of a funny reminder of a more serious issue we have in the field is, lots of nurses have this long train of, letters after our names. And many people, honestly, outside of the buildings we work in, don't know what all that means. And so I think that combined with, just kind of history and culture, media often their first go-to is not a nurse. It's not who they don't understand what we do. And so they don't recognize us as like the expert in the field. And so it turns to somebody else. I think gender plays a role too. Women are half as likely as men to be quoted in the media. And so that combined with kind of this confusion in the field about what nursing is and what nursing scientists do, I think, just contributes to that. I also think different areas lend themselves to nurses not being utilized as experts. And, my area of palliative care and pediatrics is a great example. There are many amazing nurse leaders doing, very rigorous, impactful research in palliative care. Nursing is still not driving that field of science, though. They're just not. I think it's slowly starting to change, but I think, the confusion in the field combined with kind of history of who media turns to, and still having some, other leaders that media turns to, I think those are some of the things that have contributed to it.
Thank you, Tara. Sounds like we definitely need to keep increasing our visibility and working on that alphabet soup.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Thank you. Benjamin, I have a question for you. As the only male on the panel, do you think we've made any headway in not stereotyping the male nurse on TV?
Very, very great question. And in preparation for tonight, I decided I'm just going to Google famous male nurse actors. And there were 2 that popped up. One of them was due to a role of being a very disturbed and aggressive nurse, and the other one for his physique and his looks. So that tells me that we're not quite there yet. And if you think of whether it be TV media or social media, men in nursing tend to be highlighted for characteristics other than our brains, other than our intellect, other than our contribution. It's because we're strong and able to pull the heavy patient. It's because we're silly, funny, and goofy, or it's because we can be that scapegoat and the person that that everybody can blame things on or look at, and oh, he has nice arms, let's touch his arms. But it's not really for our true contributions to nursing. So I don't think we're there just yet. And that's is it that the media hasn't recognized that what we're doing? I mean, we go on social media and there's some really, really funny nursing memes, but a lot of it plays into bias. It pokes fun at an individual's gender or gender identity or their race. And it really isn't about what can actually a man can bring to the nursing profession. So we're not there yet, but I am optimistic as we're moving forward. And as both Tara and Lucretia and Susanna mentioned, as we are, as nurses, are being brought more into the limelight, that all of our individual contributions to the nursing discipline profession will be recognized as well.
Wow. Sounds like we still have quite a bit of work, Benjamin, right?
Yes, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. Well, my last question based on TV and media, before we get on the topic of race and gender a little bit more, and any one of you on the panel can answer, is we've heard from the panel last month that during COVID, some of our VUSN alumni became spokespersons for their organizations. How do you feel we can keep that momentum going, especially when sometimes they often turn to people like Dr. Oz or Dr. Phil as experts versus maybe turning to us nurses?
I would say step up to the plate. There is such an opportunity for nurses to step up, and be a leader and be at the table. So I would say, seek out those opportunities and volunteer, step up to the plate. Take it as an opportunity and speak up.
I would like to say that we had a mass immunization clinic here in Nashville, and maybe that's happened across the country, where nurses and nurse practitioners had the opportunity to highlight kind of what they were doing and got some exposure in that regard. But I agree with you that, Tara, this is just a matter of not really understanding the role of what nurses do. And it's almost like we're hidden in plain sight. We're here, we're there, we're everywhere. We wear many hats. We have a lot of wonderful contributions to what we do on a daily basis. And we're absolutely capable, adaptable, and we are the experts in the field in terms of medicine, in clinical medicine, and in disaster medicine, and in community medicine. So I agree. It's just there's an opportunity for us to be able to have more exposure, more discussion. I think it would really highlight the profession in the light that it's intended to be.
Excellent.
I'm going to jump in.
Go ahead.
It's Lou. I'm sorry, it's Lou Boland. Yeah, it's a really great question. And when you mentioned Dr. Oz and Dr. Phil, it's like this extreme dramatization, and it's of what healthcare providers do. And oftentimes, I think what happens is nurses are overshadowed, or they're lost in whatever is going on. And this really is an opportunity for nursing. One of the things that we did, because we recognized that during the pandemic, we weren't seeing as many cases, whether that was children, men, women. And so what we decided to do was to create a PSA. And that PSA, we actually worked with our law enforcement partners as well as community-based partners to really continue to stress that we were continuing to provide these services, that we were, our services were staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by, advanced practice nurses. And it actually helped quite a bit as we began to publish those PSAs on social media. I'm going to keep going back to that, social YouTube, Instagram, that and connect these with our district attorney's office. So just to take advantage of the opening that was there to talk about what nurses do and what we're doing, and that we're still out there, actually very much an integral part of the effort in the COVID, as well as continuing to provide services for a whole host of issues and problems and people.
And I think nursing can't wait to, just have somebody come to us. I think we just need to be able to step out sometimes, make our voices heard, help increase that visibility. And if it means we have to educate people in our roles, we have to do so, right? So we'll have to keep working on that. So let's turn a little bit towards another topic, which is race and gender. Benjamin, I'm going to turn first to you. You've done a study at Duke about recognizing gender-based incivility in nursing education. How does that play out?
Yeah, it's quite a disturbing matter. And I do want to take the moment to say that my study was on gender-based incivility, but we know that incivility is alive and well, and it's not just gender-based. Racism is very, very much present in our institutions. Ageism, very much present in our institutions. And yes, I'm at Duke, I'm a Vanderbilt alumni. We are, it doesn't matter the level of your institution, we are all at risk, and we all need to be aware of this. And that's really what our study looked at. I am one of the faculty sponsors for the American Association of Men in Nursing at Duke, and we were hearing from our students that there were these things that were happening and microaggressions. And as we dug deeper and really uncovered what a lot of this was, it was very disturbing. And the literature has this very, very well discussed, that when you have a population that is typically repressed or oppressed, women. I mean, as Lucretia mentioned, the Me Too movement, we know for centuries women have been oppressed and repressed. And now that repressed population is now the dominant population. You get this swinging of the pendulum, so that population is now trying to protect themselves and hold on to something that is so dear to them. And women have been the key force in nursing for years. And some of the men who have been contributors to nursing, Walter Whitman, we know him as a poet. We don't know him as a nurse. Most of us know Luther Christman, but those don't get heard about as much as the contributions of women. So then you get this swinging effect where the women are now, or I shouldn't say women, individuals who identify as female, that's more a proper way to term it, are then trying to protect their, what is theirs, because so much has been removed and taken and stripped from them. And so through our study, when our point wasn't to see, does this happen at Duke? We figured it's happening everywhere. The literature says that. What we need is for our educators, our faculty, our instructors to know how to recognize it and what to do about it. Because the students said, the students who identified as male said, we truly feel like the faculty don't know. And when talking to the faculty in one of our pre-surveys, they all said, no, we've never seen it. And then as we built this training module in this training session, we had a live full day training workshop. At the end of it, they were all the faculty were just, even the male faculty were just shaking their heads of, wow, we just had no clue. And like I said, this is a gender component, but incivility is happening to all minority groups, whether it be based on gender, race, or age. So it's going to be a really, really amazing publication. We are on our third set of reviews, so hopefully it will be published very, very soon. And we're looking forward to working with other universities to help train their faculty as well.
Benjamin, we're looking forward to reading that. So thank you. And thank you for doing that important work too. I think it'll be very beneficial for faculty and looking at different perspectives in education. So thank you for their students. Tara, do you feel sexism itself is still in nursing science?
Yeah, so great question. I do. So I feel like it presents itself differently in nursing science. So the tables I sit at these days as director of the program, it's just very different for our field, I feel like, compared to the other sciences. So for example, in nursing, it's such a small percent of nurses who have a doctorate degree, for example, like less than 1% of nurses will obtain a PhD. Well, so of those, for example, it's less than 2% of PhD students who identify themselves as male. So it's such a, and in other fields, for example, across, VU's graduate school, it's completely opposite, right? Like just the ratio is flipped. And so it's just really different. So often, I'm the lone person at the table, like, well, in nursing, it's really different, it's completely opposite. And a lot of people don't realize that or don't recognize that. I think, we kind of get in our own space and, often as multidisciplinary as we tend to be, sometimes I even forget, like, oh, it's so different in other fields. So I think nursing is very unique in that way. I also think, kind of back to the previous conversation about leadership and nurses being seen as leaders and experts, I definitely see that sometimes at the table if there's just a lack of diversity around the room or things like that. I think sometimes it makes it hard. I mean, I talk to students sometimes, you talk about leadership positions they're in, but they feel like they're in the minority, and it just makes it hard to raise your hand and speak up. Or and so really trying to build up that next generation and teach those, leadership skills, and also having diversity. I think that's key too, of having diverse faculty and diverse nurses to raise up that next generation, to bring in a diverse pool of new students. So those are things I see happening in nursing science.
Thank you, Tara. So this last gender-based question is, I'm going to open it up to all of the panel before we get into some of the solutions that we'll talk about as we conclude. What about aggression against nurses in general, especially based on gender or race? What have you seen out there, and how does that hurt the image of what you believe nursing is? And anyone on the panel can answer.
I'm going to jump in. It's Lou.
Sure.
And Tara and Ben, thank you so much for what you said. And Ben, I'm looking forward to reading your article as well. But I think that, we're at a watershed moment around diversity and inclusion and race. And I have to say that it's really my feeling and my heart that nursing's always been at the forefront of advocacy and addressing inequality and inequity. However, these are really difficult conversations for folks to have. And I think at this point where there is an openness, a willingness to explore, that it becomes really essential if we're talking about rebranding nurses or nursing 2030, nursing 2025, that we have to start having these kinds of very challenging conversations. What I've seen more specifically related to what is now the term is BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, People of Color, nursing professionals, looks more along the lines of commonly microaggression, micro insults, micro invalidations. Maybe the APRN is thought to be the social worker, or maybe if you're working in the emergency department, you're wearing scrubs and everybody in the emergency department is wearing scrubs. Maybe you work for environmental services. Maybe you work for dietary, which really, invalidates all the efforting, the work, the role for particularly Black nurses or nurses of color. After I got the questions, I started reading a little bit, and I came across this great article, and the title of the article is Beyond the Naming, Institutional Racism in Nursing, and it was published in 2020 and written by Dean Villarreal and Professor Broom. And both of those folks really, I was so happy to see this happen, that these are folks who have tremendous amount of presence, tremendous amount of power. They can move the conversation in a particular direction about, let's begin to look at how this has played out in nursing. And so I'm really glad that this conversation is happening. I'm really glad that we're talking about diversity and inclusion. But as that article said, and I'll reference that article again, We need to go from naming the isms to actually trying to dismantle some of these isms. And I think that, racism is learned, sexism, those isms are learned, and I think that we can unlearn them.
Wow, yeah, I fully agree. Anyone else would like to comment before we move on to maybe discussing some solutions?
I would like to think that administration is going to get behind this, because for so many years, the adage or the impression was the patient is always right, the customer is always right. Our nurses should not and shouldn't be, I wish I could think of a stronger word, but shouldn't be expected to tolerate incivility, racism, and harassment from the patients. And so many times the patient says something or aggressively punches a nurse, and it's the nurse's fault for being too close. And there's no protection against the nurses. We've got to stand behind our nurses, and administration has to protect us. And the law has to be able to protect us.
Agreed. And I know like Georgia was trying to pass a law where I live about that. And I know several states have it on their dockets to look at passing legislation with concerns over incivility and threats towards nurses. So yes, that's important. Well, let's move to our last part of our panel, and let's talk about some solutions. I'd like to refer first to, and I'm going to open up these next set of questions to anyone on the panel to answer. The first one I would like to refer to is based on the Woodhull report that came out in the 1990s and was recently revised in 2018. In this report, it showed that only 2% of nurses were quoted in the articles about healthcare issues. How do you feel that hurts our profession and perceptions of us in the general public?
Well, I can start us off. So I think one thing it really hurts is just thinking about the next generation, but I'm thinking like young people, like elementary school age children and high school children. If they're not seeing nurses in that position, in the general public, I just think it like they're not raised like seeing nurses in that role or seen as the expert, or they don't learn what our discipline is, and one of the assignments I give my students in class now is to go speak to an elementary classroom or high school. Well, we had to do it mock this year, of course, with COVID, but prior to COVID, they would go do a classroom visit and talk about, and for the PhD program, it's, talk about what is a nurse scientist and what do you do and what's your job? And, but, you could relate it to an advanced practice nursing. Like a lot of people still don't, although we've come so far, there's been such progress at like defining to the general public about what nursing is. But I think that's one way that hurts when that few nurses are quoted in the media. Our young people are being raised and don't really, there's not as much opportunity for them to really understand and see nurses using their voice. So, but it creates opportunity, right, for us to really be proactive and, but we may have to create those opportunities more so than waiting for those opportunities to just come to us.
I agree, Tara. Unfortunately, I feel like we're sometimes always fighting with that and trying to make our voices heard. And, we're used to being pulled up our bootstraps, so to speak. So I think it is important. We've got to find a way to increase that visibility and continue, making sure they're coming to us as the experts. I think as Benjamin and Lucretia have said as well, in some of their work that, that what we're doing here in healthcare, and we have a stake here. So on Wednesday, the second part of the series will address scope of practice issues. We know that's a hot topic, and especially in some of those of us that live in the South, where most of the states still remain restrictive in nature to practice. How do you feel it affects the public when APRNs are prevented from using all of their skills or being able to practice to the extent of their education and training that they've received?
I can probably speak to this. Well,
All right, Susanna.
you know, again, it's going to go back to the educational piece, the educational awareness of the public, and actually what we do. We're seen generally as nurses, the nursing profession, and that's the label that we're given, the title that we're given, as Lucretia kind of alluded to in her reference. But there's a whole iceberg of depth to us, and experiences and training and education and capability. If you're trained in multiple disciplines, that's not going to be evident in your title. That has to come from a conversation that you have. For example, prospective jobs that you're going to, find your voice, have that conversation, be proud of what you've accomplished in your education, and be like, yes, I'm a professional nurse, I'm a professional advanced practice person, but this is my education, this is my training, this is what I'm capable of doing, adapting, overcoming, and bringing that to the table in those types of situations, and also educating the public and educating your patients, and being confident in what you have accomplished and should be very, very proud of. And I think sometimes because we've been considered, not in the forefront or leadership roles, we kind of always take that passive stance back. And I think now in this a year of pandemic and us being highlighted in what we are completely capable of doing, I think that that's going to change, and bringing more awareness by social media, highlighting our colleagues and our peers, establishing those collaborative relationships, and letting our peers know and the collaborators know what we're capable of, because sometimes they're just not aware. So to answer the question, it's an awareness that you have to find your voice, be able to be proud of what you've done, be able to articulate that, and want shared and collaborative experiences, so that the patients can benefit from the full spectrum of your capability and your academic preparation. And it starts with a conversation.
Very well said, Susanna. And I would add to it, doing policy a lot in our state, is we need to educate our legislators too, because they also will be the ones that will help us to make some of these changes. So a lot of times they're not aware of what we do. So also, it's not just educating the public, but educating your stakeholders and also the legislators who can help you make some changes that benefit the citizens of your state. So excellent. Thank you. So I've got a question about international work. So I know I have students where I teach, and they ask me about studying abroad or working abroad, more importantly, as a nurse or nurse practitioner. So we have many, people want to do global work, give back, missionary work, that type of thing. So how do you see our role in helping to maybe increase visibility of the APRN role, nurse practitioner role, because in many countries it may look very differently? And how could we help to maybe set some standards, or maybe role model with other countries and cultures to maybe help evolve the nurse practitioner role or APRN role in other areas outside of the US? So who would like to tackle it?
I'm happy to start us off on that
Benjamin.
question. I've had the opportunity in my career to do a significant amount of international work, both as a provider, RN, as well as an APRN, and as a faculty member. And there's very few, when you consider all the countries of the globe, very few that actually recognize nurse practitioners, some of them being Australia, Canada, some Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, New Zealand, as some examples. But APRNs as a whole, midwives are recognized very heavily throughout the globe. Next to that are your nurse anesthetists, and nurse anesthesia has different levels in different countries. Some of them are equivalent to our diploma nursing, where you learn on the job. Some of them are graduate programs. But the NP, you have some FNPs. I'm an acute care nurse practitioner, not very many acute care. As a matter of fact, in many countries, you have to have a master's in critical care to be a bedside RN in critical care. So yeah, our model here in the US is not as heavily recognized. I've recently been invited onto the advisory board for the King Saud bin Abdulaziz University for Health Sciences in Saudi Arabia. It's a mouthful. They reached out to me as just a director of an acute care program here in the US and said, we are looking to start this in our country. Help. We don't know how to do this. We don't know the curriculum. We don't know what an NP can do. Many of their physicians are either European and US trained, so they're familiar, but they don't have that role yet. So yeah, helping them build this from ground up and get it through their version of legislation and national acknowledgement. So yeah, from that global aspect, what can we do? If you have that opportunity, look into it, reach out. It's very scary, very intimidating, but we are one of the global leaders in advanced practice nursing and NP, not just education, but practice and scope of practice. And we can serve as that model. So whether it be in Saudi Arabia, in the Caribbean, in South America, part of us being nurses is to be leaders and to be educators. So we need to go for it.
Excellent. Well, a good first start, Benjamin, is helping us to in the Middle East to help get the nurse practitioner role more visible. So definitely it's one of those, I think we just have to keep role modeling, stepping up, educating again, and to help people understand what we do. And we're still doing that in the US, much less also the need abroad. So thank you for your work on that. We look forward to hearing more about it. So to our panel, we have our last question as we conclude for the evening. So any of you can jump in. Lastly, if we could wave a magic wand and instantly make any change, what would you want the public to know about the reality of nursing and of course, APRN roles?
I'm going to jump in here. I read this question over and over and over, and I thought we're not, and I hope I don't say anything, but we're not your grandma's nursing, and we're not Sarah Gomp, and that nurses and APRNs and the profession has really evolved. This really is nursing 4.0, 5.0, and I really would like the public to know that, and I think that requires us to do a lot of politicking and get involved with, statewide, get involved on a federal level, and to actually talk about who we are, what we do. And this is very, very, very important for public image. The other thing is, I think that we, there's a part of this question, wave a magic wand, what would we do? It just has to be our priority to have advanced practice, be that there's no restriction on advanced practice. We're not working under the guise of physicians, that we actually are working in a larger context to make a healthcare system that's efficient and effective, and that physicians have their roles, and nurses, nurse practitioners, advanced practice providers have their role. And we just have to take risks and get in the policy arena. And finally, what I'll say, because I'm interested to hear what other folks have to say, I spent some time on Twitter, and I am really amazed and really actually proud of the number of folks that I find on Twitter. And I'm going to throw out a few names. Dr. Ray Walker, who talks about nursing and gender. There's Dr. Monica McLemore at UCSF, who talks about infant mortality and disparate treatment and structural racism. There's Dr. Paula Kagan that talks about media images and feminism. There's Lindsay Hughes, Dr. Lindsay Hughes, and there's Dr. Linda Canty. So I believe that, in order to change the public, we have to get more involved in the strategies that are available to us, and social media provides an opportunity for us to do that.
It helps us provide a different platform we've never had before, so we can utilize
it. Absolutely.
Thank you, Lucretia. Some other thoughts?
I would like to say that my general overview of the profession of nursing, since I was a small child, knew that I was going to be a nurse. It's an empathic and compassionate profession that's just filled with strength, humor, adaptability, it encompasses so many emotions and so much strength. And it's come a long way since I started the nursing profession. And I think that, again, highlighting it, giving, complimentary kudos to your colleagues. And my overarching goal is that we can work collaboratively with mutual respect and to the fullest extent of our academic preparation and capability. And because the outcomes and that long-term goal is the same, we want good patient outcomes. So that's, if I had a magic wand, that's what I would wish.
So well said, Susanna. At the end of the day, it's not about our practice as much as it's about the people that we're caring for.
Yeah.
That needs to be the priority. Excellent. Benjamin or Tara, any last thoughts on that question?
Go ahead, Tara. I
think
saw
we
us both
unmuted
unmute at the same time.
Yeah.
No, I mean, what's been said so far is so well said. If I could wave a magic wand, I think it would be that people would recognize nurses as the leaders that nurses already are. And I, just to get there, I think teamwork and collaboration and, publishing what we do, that sounds so simple, but just, I think, to spread that word, because nursing is just, it's driven by science. It truly is a scientific, driven discipline that's driving that advanced care to patients. So.
Thank you. And getting our work out there, right? To be quoted. Benjamin.
And I would quote or echo what Lucretia mentioned earlier: is we are not the nurses of decades ago. Our job is
Let's hear it back in the room. Yes.
Yeah. Our job is more than to pass pills, to clean up bedpans, to serve food. We are saving lives. People don't get admitted. And of course, I'm an acute care clinician, so I'm biased to the in-hospital setting, but people don't get admitted into the hospital for 24-hour doctor care. They get admitted for 24-hour nursing care, and we're the ones at the bedside. We're the ones making those life-saving decisions. At 3 a.m, I'm the one making the decision to intubate, to change medications, to, with our COVID patients, change the regimens, because the docs are usually in their call room. And that's just the way it is. But the public doesn't realize that we are the ones really driving both the nursing and sometimes the medical profession. So magic wand, I would love the public to recognize that.
Awesome. Thank you, Benjamin. So I would like to thank all of my panel members here tonight as we conclude. This has been wonderful. I've enjoyed doing this with you all. And as I think Lucretia said, that the mantra at the end is, this is not your grandma's nursing, right? Is that what we were saying? So we can end on that. But yes, it's a new day. This is the time for nursing to get their voice out there, speak up, advocate, be visible, help build, and expand our roles. But more importantly, it's also about the client and the people we serve at the end of the day. Before I end, I would just like to do a quick plug to remind you that May 12th is part 2 of this series of VUSN alumni and faculty panelists. And in that panel, they will discuss the range of professions that fall under nursing and full practice authority. And that will be at 4 p.m. Central Time. Again, we would like to wish everyone a happy Nurses Week. This was all of us celebrating and coming together as Vanderbilt alumni, and we're glad we could have this tonight. So thank you, and happy Nurses Week to everyone.
Thank you
Have
so much.
Good evening. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Be well.